Baseball, obesity, country music are all stereotypes of Americans, but do these things actually define us and our experience? Throughout American history, there has been a constant struggle to achieve freedom. Evidence proves that Americans would stop at nothing to reach these natural rights of life, liberty, and property as defined by John Locke.
At the conclusion of the French and Indian War, the British imposed various acts on the colonists to pay off war debt. In the 1760s, the British introduced taxes on sugar, paper, documents, and glass. In 1765, the British required colonists to house their soldiers, which most colonists felt was a violation of their privacy.
Where's the bathroom at?
The colonists refused to abide by these acts. As they resisted more and more, the British exerted greater control on the rebelling masses. The Townshend Acts were passed in 1767. This put a high tax on all tea, except for tea from the British East India Tea Company. The act was meant to benefit the failing tea company, which essentially granted them a monopoly on American trading. Colonists viewed this act as an abuse of power and boycotted British tea. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, an organized group that strived to protect the rights of the colonists, boarded ships located on the Boston Harbor and began throwing British East India tea off the boats into the harbor. The estimated cost of the tea thrown overboard was $1 million in today's money. This act of civil disobedience, as well as others during colonial times, pushed colonists to the breaking point. Throughout the colonial era, colonists argued, "Give me liberty or give me death," in response to the vile acts the British put on them. They established the Continental Congress and in 1776 drafted the Declaration of Independence as a way to declare their separation from Britain. In the Declaration of Independence, the colonists stated that all men are created equal and were entitled to certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and property. These ideas were based off of John Locke's ideas of basic rights that everyone was entitled to have, and other Enlightenment ideas. Because of this, rebellions were inspired against the overarching rule throughout the course of history. The reactions the colonists had in response to the excessive power that the British held over them was necessary for them to attain their natural rights. Because of this, Americans developed a national pride for their country by standing up for their rights. With the formation of a new constitution, a more effective government was created. Attached to this was the Bill of Rights, forming the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. The American Revolution was vital to the American journey. It was the beginning of it all, the creation of the United States as a unified and independent country. It is what makes our country unique in history, and its principles that led to the nation's founding continue to influence American society. It offered a priceless chance for freedom, whether by petitioning legislators for emancipation or by gaining freedom by fighting with the Americans. It marked a new era in which society would be dedicated to the concept of liberty and equality for all. While it wasn't perfect and the principles were restricted, they would later be changed to broaden the extent of democracy. This revolution serves as an example of ideas that Americans would be fighting to acquire over the course of history.
Immigration was a major source of population growth and cultural change. While many immigrants assumed that coming to America meant instant wealth and prosperity, many were greatly mistaken. Due to the spread of nativism and the fear of distrust of foreigners, controversy was caused regarding ethnicity, economic benefits, jobs for non-immigrants, crime, and voting behavior. Prior to the Civil War, old immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe, more specifically Ireland, Germany, and England. At the time, conflict arose because Irish and Germans were seen as political threats, often voting Democrat. In reaction to this, the Know Nothing Party desired to ban Catholics from holding office and called for tougher immigration and naturalization laws. A new wave of immigrants came from Eastern and Southern Europe during the late 19th century. During this time, roads and bridges began connecting cities, leading to the expansion of city limits. Modern conveniences such as electricity, indoor plumbing, and the telephone provided the glamour that attracted thousands to the city. Between 1866 and 1950, more than 25 million foreigners left their homeland for the United States. These newcomers had little money and a limited understanding of the English language. Unlike the old immigrants who bought land and started businesses, the new ones were willing to accept low-paying jobs in the city. More often than not, people sharing the same nationality congregated in common sections of the city, creating neighborhoods like Little Italy and Chinatown. The development of churches and synagogues and schools allowed these new immigrants to experience the freedoms of America, but maintain their traditional culture. However, as more people arrived to these small neighborhoods, living conditions worsened. Because of this, city sewers and water facilities could not keep up with the expanding cities, and there was a tremendous amount of waste.
Jacob Riis's study, called How the Other Half Lives, demonstrates these hardships.
During the late 1800s, activists established settlement houses to provide services to poor members of the community. Workers taught residents how to adjust to the American way of life and tried to educate them of socially acceptable behavior. The most famous American example was Hull House, founded by Jane Addams, who used her ideas to help poor immigrants. When it opened in 1889 in a Greek, Russian, and German community, Hull House offered English language instruction, health and nutritional education, childcare services, and social activities. Throughout this time, there was an increased fighting to improve living conditions, and when Congress became involved, lawmakers passed regulations in housing and working conditions, wages and daily work limit, and labor involving women and children. By 1910, Eastern and Southern Europeans made up to 70% of the immigrants entering the United States, but by 1914, this dropped because of the war, and later because of immigration restrictions set in the 1920s. Restriction legislation aimed towards immigrants from Asia was encouraged by nativists. The Chinese Exclusion Act that was placed in 1882 was imposed indefinitely in 1902, barring the entry of Chinese laborers. Numerous bills in Congress advocated the suspension of immigration due to high unemployment and even deported non-Americans who experienced financial difficulties. For 3 decades, the battle over immigration restriction was seen in Congress. In 1921, immigration was limited to 3% of the nationality present in the United States, and by 1924, 2%, despite protests from many Native people. Having almost completely assimilated into American society, children of these immigrants helped pave the way for the New Deal of the 1930s, the Great Society of the 1960s, and the 1965 Immigration Act that allowed a new wave of immigration from Asia and Latin America to arrive. Immigrants and their descendants were important in the development of popular American culture and created a positive image of immigration in the American mind. These immigrants have played a part in American art, including writing, directing, producing, and acting in American films for the first half of the 20th century. The first and second generation immigrants have always been anxious to assimilate to American society and help broaden American culture.
So during the Civil Rights Movement, can you remember a time when you witnessed racial discrimination?
Personally, I did not, because I lived in an area where there were no African Americans. I heard about discrimination going on. I know my mother raised me not to be discriminatory towards others, but I did not personally see anything.
Okay. And then how do you think the Civil Rights Movement kind of affected America? You know, how did you see like a change or?
In Missouri, it was a very slow change.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you people noticed too much difference until probably 10 years later.
The Civil Rights Movement affected the American experience by showing the struggles of a certain race to obtain their freedom as Americans. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X used their beliefs and wit to reach their goals of becoming true Americans. Dr. King used the approach of nonviolent protests such as sit-ins and boycotts. On the other hand, Malcolm X believed in using violence to obtain this freedom. He was involved in the use of Black Power, who wanted to smash everything Western civilization had created. In Malcolm X's speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, he argues that blacks are not Americans because of their lack of right that the Declaration of Independence bestows upon the American citizens. Black Power really took effect after the Vietnam War. The African American soldiers were appalled by the conditions in which they encountered upon their return, and immediately entered into another war for their rights and freedoms as true Americans. The Civil Rights Movement caused different racial groups to unite and fight for a similar cause of equal treatment and opportunities.
Many Americans have worked tirelessly for their own freedoms and the freedoms of others. From the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, creating a new nation, through today, freedom has been argued for, fought for, and died for. The radical ideas of the United States of America have proven nearly exclusive throughout history. The promises of opportunity not bound by a social class or an autocratic government have proven attractive to immigrants from all over the world. The list of rights given by the Constitution of the United States has been both added to and taken from for the sake of individual freedoms. Those who worked so hard for the revolutionary idea of freedom and equality, and those who took hold of that idea and put it to use without letting go, are the people who have defined the American experience as a constant struggle to achieve freedom. This motivation to gain individual rights and to achieve freedom as a whole is what proves that Americans truly will stop at nothing to reach their own rights and the rights of so many others. The natural rights of life, liberty, and in the words of Thomas Jefferson, the pursuit of happiness.